Welcome to the next installment of our CPQ webinar series. Today I'm joined by my wonderful co-host and guest, Adam Wainwright, Director of Product Management and Commerce Hub at HubSpot.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So really excited about today's session. This is one I've been looking forward to because today we're not talking about any third-party tools. We're not talking about add-ons. We're talking about native HubSpot functionality, which is my jam. So if you're at Inbound, you saw many awesome product announcements. One that most people are really excited about is our new configure price quoting functionality directly in the CRM. And so today we're going to break down what that actually means for sales velocity, for your sales reps experience, and revenue data integrity. So first question, kind of a softball, Adam here, but in your own words, or for those who may not have context, what did HubSpot actually launch? Well, why does it matter?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it certainly for those of us that were at HubSpot, I'm sure we're aware there were a ton of things that were announced, and so indeed, speaking on behalf of the Commerce Hub, yes, we launched a native built on the HubSpot ecosystem configure price quote technology. We launched this after an acquisition that HubSpot had made about a year ago. And actually, I'm coming on board from that team. I've spent my career in revenue operations space, forecasting AI, CPQ, even some contract lifecycle management. But the net headline is what I've learned across my career is revenue is a process. And so having good business systems, Brian, I think you teed it up nicely, that prevent friction and ultimately help you with data integrity in the quoting process, ultimately will help you run a smoother downstream revenue lifecycle. And so ultimately at the core of our new CPQ product is going to be a revenue engine that will help sellers run fast, will give executives visibility, but most importantly, will maintain that revenue integrity so you can start to deploy a better strategy and help you protect margin, scale profitably, et cetera.
Yeah, that's those as a CRO, those are things that are definitely very important to me, Adam, and I appreciate you sharing that. I think just some other things just confirming that I believe are correct here. CPQ is part of Commerce Hub, right?
Yeah,
So Commerce Hub really entirely got a big upgrade. I think a lot of people are saying, CPQ, but like really all of Commerce Hub really was upgraded to support this year. Also really excited about some of the workflow capabilities there, quote to cash and that kind of stuff. And you mentioned it, but just double down on it. The reporting capabilities from our perspective, greatly enhanced. A lot more visibility into where time is being spent, where your reps are getting stuck, et cetera. Speaking of getting stuck, a challenge that many revenue leaders have is deals do get stuck, and it's not always clear where that's happening. And so, let's talk about an actual sale motion here. Where do teams still see friction when it comes to kind of quoting inside the CRM, and what are some of the common breakdowns that you've seen your experience, Adam?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so for what it's worth, I'm coming on board as a product manager. And again, sort of giving the background, I've spent the majority of my career in revenue operations, but I've always been in the sales leader, either a sales individual or a sales leadership capacity. So I am no stranger to the emotional burden that a lot of these systems can introduce when we're trying to figure out just exactly how to get my customer who's told me I want to sign over the finish line. And so it's an excellent question in terms of where the process breaks down. If the business systems that we're ultimately using to go to market aren't built with speed and frankly, visibility in mind, there's just no world where they're not going to promote some sense of friction. And all too often, I've had many situations, and I'm sure certainly, Brian, you may have this over the duration of your career as well, where your sellers can't they just can't, for whatever reason, get the quote out the door, or perhaps some tweaks are being made or asked at the last mile. And now it means in many cases, I have to cold start an entire quoting process all over again. So these are some of the areas that we wanted to be very deliberate and intentional with how we were thinking about building the CPQ. But there are some really exciting additional things that we had built because we're built natively on the HubSpot ecosystem, and tracking engagement, for example, is something that we just do out of the box. We built a really exciting capability inside of the CPQ, for example, called Analyze. And so now sellers can simply go into their quote system inside of HubSpot, and they can literally track all of their quotes and the engagement they're getting from the buyer. And so as they're sending those deals out and they're effectively trading discounts for deadlines, how do we hold our buyers accountable? Well, we have to be able to measure where we're seeing engagement so we can curate those professional nudges and hold our customers to account when they've, of course, put the screws to us as sellers and asked for, discounts and the moon. And so that's one simple example, and I can show you later, but that's one simple example of how we've promoted some visibility to, again, reduce that friction, give control back to the seller, and ultimately give our CROs and our CEOs a more predictable forecast.
Agree. And also, I mean, like reducing time to close, right? As we know, time kills deals. And we're in Q4 here, 2025,
There you
guys.
go.
And it's a busy time of the year for revenue leaders. So, really, really important perspective there. Want to talk about your background here a little bit from a RevOps perspective and my own passion here and up to date here. But look, RevOps leaders, we've been taping together quoting workflows for years. With the native CPQ functionality finally here, what does that unlock from an operations standpoint? So, adjacent to revenue leaders, MOPS and SOPS leaders, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first and obvious thing, obviously, is we get to completely relish and benefit from the power of platform. So to the extent that there are data properties that I'm trying to use to, again, master or curate my sales process, so I can do those things. I can truncate, I can shorten or accelerate my deal cycles, shorten my timelines. We will now have access to all of the adjacent objects and properties necessary to actually run and better build the sales process and the quoting process from the same data set that, of course, perhaps is tracking and managing my marketing operations and my sales and sales operations. So that's sort of just an inherent capability. But we've also launched a very deep set of approvals workflows, again, leveraging the approval
Mhm.
workflow engine out of the box, but we've curated it specific to quotes. And so now as a result, we can create triggers on approvals, for example, using something that all of our revenue operations or admins who are comfortable with HubSpot just know how to use. But we're also able to cross-pollinate with, again, properties from other objects and make those a
Yep.
part of the approvals process. And so, yeah, we can really now build a far more rich and robust set of approvals requirements, but in an ecosystem and in a world where the sellers don't have to go swivel share, right? Exit one system, go find perhaps a product catalog in some other system, and then come back and figure out how to make it work so the deal does because I'm breathing down our neck, etc. So, some examples of how we're able to really stretch the limits of the HubSpot ecosystem in a world now where we can give more governance and control back to our business.
Yeah, you said it well there, Adam. My team here, particularly my solution architects, really excited kind of about some of those advanced approval logics. I think everybody was super happy to see where we're taking advantage of the power of our native workflow engine, obviously, right? And I think you said, relishing and capitalized on the power platform. I'm going to
Yeah.
quote you on that one. I think that's a good one here. We're already seeing that start to kind of eliminate some of the silos around quoting. And so that's pretty exciting. Very bullish there. I think something that I talk about when CPQ comes up in the peer groups I'm in, at least, many revenue leaders don't know like when to pursue a CPQ solution. Like, at certain stage of growth, like it makes sense, but there's, like I know if I need a CRM, if I don't have one, right? I can only use Excel for so long. I think the clarity into when, hey man, I really need a CPQ solution is a little bit less clear. What are some kind of drivers or factors or contributing things that you think, might be clues that, hey, it's time to kind of investigate a proper CPQ tool?
It's an awesome question, and it's the right question to toil with. One thing I learned early in my career, working in the revenue tangent, revenue operations space, is every business deals with a digital transformation journey. Every business kind of there, and we've sort of uncovered during my career, working with various analysts over the years. There's sort of like four kind of core phases of the growth of your company. The tribal phase, you sort of hero selling executives running the business, and then you sort of begin to standardize and specialize. And now you sort of start to take one person who's wearing 7 or 8 or 9 hats. And now you actually start to hire frontline leaders, maybe second line leaders, et cetera. Right when we're starting to specialize and we're going to start to improve and start to create some levels of standards, this is where CPQ starts to make sense. But the real question that kind of goes the second level deeper is like, do we need to create really firm rules because of what the products that we sell warrant some heavy duty configurator? And that's where I think a lot of people tend to sort of get confused about CPQ. The real reason why we're typically trying to implement a CPQ really is because what we want to do is we want to protect revenue integrity. What we really want to do is create
Hmm.
business systems and the appropriate workflows so that downstream parties and cross-functional team members, it might be accounts receivable, it might be finance, they can get data that's reliable. And we can begin to implement some guardrails that start helping us get better control over a revenue strategy. So, for example, if we're building new product and we want to protect our margin, or we want to implement some rules that will help sellers start to feel like they need to get some approvals, perhaps an implementation is being thrown in for free. Simple example, we want to nip that in the bud because we want that to be a revenue center, not a cost center. These are the kinds of questions that begin to kind of percolate when CPQ becomes warranted. It's not necessarily always associated with heavy duty configuration requirements. And so in that world, there's kind of like there's two axes. It's how complex is my selling environment, might warrant CPQ earlier, and how complex is my revenue life cycle. And if there's complexity in terms of like the data flow from quote to the downstream business systems, that is another good example, which will often happen earlier in that digital transformation journey for many businesses. So I like to think of if I'm standardizing, if I'm optimizing, if I want control of my revenue strategy, that's a perfect opportunity to start looking at CPQ.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you for that. I was actually chatting with a CFO, what's today, Thursday, earlier this week. And they're exploring CPQ solutions.
Mm.
HubSpot is one, and he said, "You know what's interesting? Like where we do fine in Excel." He said, "But where I really get stuck as a finance leader is," he said, "I can see our standard discount, right? I can see our average discount, right? I just don't know how we got there." And he's
Yeah.
like, it's so hard for me to financially forecast because are we going to market at, our market price and then discount down to 15%? Are my reps leading with 15%? He's like, I don't know. And, they've got about 40 reps, and I imagine that's thousands of deals at scale. He's like, I need a CPQ solution that can say, hey, like, where did the quote start at and where did we end? He's like, I just need to know that. He's like, because that's a 15% variance in revenue is significant. And CPQ solutions can really help fill some of those gaps that people may not even realize exist, right? I don't think the sales team is looking at that or concerned about that, but as a CFO, he was very interested in that. And we can get there, which is pretty exciting. Things
Actually,
we
I'd love
see,
to
I
even
think
jump on
also.
that. If
Please.
I sorry to interrupt, but it's like I
Yeah.
love that topic. CPQ is often not associated with CFO. Turns
Mm-mm.
out in a modern architected go-to-market business ecosystem, it absolutely should be. The CPQ should be informing the go-to-market team where they live in terms of their discounting against the cohort, where the customers are in terms of how they're purchasing, depending on various constraints like geo or if it's public sector or commercial. So to the extent that CPQ can now be a weapon for the CFO, because
Mhm.
they have to strategically plan so that they can, of course, scale their business in future quarters, that is ultimately where a CPQ that's built on your CRM infrastructure starts to really pay dividends. So I think you nailed it. I love that conversation with the CFO. CFOs are often left out of the conversation, but in tomorrow's world, they're right front and center because ultimately
Yeah.
we want to start figuring out just exactly where we can optimize right at the quote level, right when the seller is putting fingers on keyboards. So it's a great
Mhm.
call out.
Oh yeah, and likewise, we talk to marketing leaders. We often talk about marketing attribution. Where do my leads come? How do I attribute? How do I attribute them to dollars? Far less commonly, probably more importantly though, we don't talk about revenue attribution. Like how are the dollars getting tied back to the business and things we
Love
actually
it.
sell? And I think that's part of the kind of RevOps, triad we look at, which is great. Little pivot here, as teams are interested in exploring this, we hear a lot of kind of like, okay, well, we're probably ready. We're interested. Some of the drivers that you mentioned there, Adam, are kind of percolating up a little bit there. They may, what do we do next? And so I guess the question for you is kind of, what should, RevOps and GTM teams, what can they do now to start to prepare for CPQ and HubSpot? What are things they should start to
Yeah.
plan or think about or get organized?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, it's actually an awesome question because it sort of segues into how we even thought about building CPQ. So, a couple of key components to think about. The very first thing we're probably going to want to think about is: do we even have a product, a pricing and packaging, or a product strategy? Depending on where I am in my business life cycle, I may not really even have it fleshed out in terms of like how I want to package my products, and so having the ability to just throw together sort of proposals and maybe descriptions and sort of product lines, that's useful. But one of the first things that we're probably going to want to do to really get the most horsepower out of a CPQ is really understand just exactly how I want to organize my products. And then I want to perhaps try to organize and create groupings so that I can start to help the sellers determine when and where and how to best position the value statement against the actual perhaps SKU that we're going to put in front of our customer. So net headline is, if you have a dead set list of products, you're probably in good shape. If you're storming and norming on what that looks like, the nice thing is that we make that really easy to do in HubSpot. And so you can go ahead and build those to your heart's content. And so a lot of what we did was we thought, let's go ahead and think about the foundation of the product in the CPQ product by making sure that we can do as many different behaviors, product mechanics as possible. So there's a lot of ways we can kind of configure at the product or the SKU level. That's sort of big phase one. Then phase two, do I really need an approvals matrix? How complex do I want this? I talked to a CFO myself a couple of days ago who told me that we implemented a really killer set of guardrails. And the idea was I wanted to create freedom so that my sellers knew how to run based on various thresholds, but yet still 95% of the quotes hit my desk. So did we overcomplicate our approvals matrix? Probably. So to the extent that you have a point of view on what you think are the appropriate controls and guardrails necessary to give the sellers the ability to play in a safe sandbox, that's really important. If you go wide open, you're probably going to later look back from a lagging indicator that maybe there was an opportunity to sort of shore up some of the loose ends, maybe kind of tighten the Wild West behaviors. If you overdo it, then next thing you know, you've just kept your CFO up or perhaps your second line leaders up when they didn't necessarily need to be. So that's really important, thinking about those steps. But between those two, the last thing you really want to make sure is presentment. Do my customers get an experience? And if you can throw together these three swirling concerns into one system that makes it easy, speed is makes it easy and fast for a seller to produce the quote, but such that the buyer is left thinking, this is the right choice, this is the vendor I want to partner with. I look forward to value day, the day in which I come back and I thank you for charging me money, right? That one of the best artifacts that we can use is the presentment layer that's perhaps presented in the quote, because oftentimes the executive buyer is not the person who is in the evaluation. So between those three data points, I think you've kind of got a little bit of a recipe to kind of think about how you're going to organize when you're going to deploy your quote in service of your revenue strategy.
That's all great news. And just, I think a couple bullet points for me there. The workflows, understand the approved workflow, not necessarily the today, but also the kind of future plan, getting kind of tighter alignment, documenting processes, writing down your business rules, your pricing rules, getting all that document is probably pretty helpful, particularly as you approach an implementation. Certainly helps us as implementers, right, to kind of get the ball started there. This has been awesome. Adam, do you have anything that maybe you could show us some of this functionality? I know you mentioned you were excited about a couple of features you're hoping to be able to share with the group today.
Yeah, this is what I'll do is I'll show you guys like a couple of things. As I mentioned at Inbound, for those of us that attended, it was an awesome event. Obviously, Commerce Hub has a new charter to go out and really be the revenue engine for our customers. But we can't separate out the fact that we've really loaded this thing up with a ton of AI. So what I'll do, Brian, is I'll just show you a couple of things, and to anybody that's seeing this that's interested, we'll make sure that you have my contact information, and I can go real deep with you at any time. Consider, my door is always open. That said, I want to start in the actual product section, because at the foundation of the new product, the CPQ product, are the actual products themselves, meaning it's really important that we highlight a couple of the capabilities that we have delivered, so you can see that we've really poured this foundation, the concrete from which we can build this tower of value in the coming years. You can see that when you're in HubSpot, a familiar view for all of us here, you've obviously got your commerce wallet here, and you can come in and you've got a couple of new things. I'm seeing something called the closing agent AI. This will actually help the buyer perhaps ask questions, and we can train these agents so that they're answering the easier questions. And then, of course, when the buyer then slips in that last pound of flesh and says, I want that 100% discount, it'll stop them and say, let me go ahead and grab your rep for you. But before I get there, I want to just come into the product section because I want to make sure that I do say that we are on a long-term mission to drive a tremendous amount of configurability and flexibility. And it all starts with what are the product behaviors and mechanics. And so we've included examples like tiering. So very simple example now, in the event that I want my sellers to not have to worry about what the price breakpoints are per number of units, we can create that entire matrix for them so that when they're just adding number of units, we can give the customers volume discounts. We have graduated behaviors. So like in this example, maybe if my customer wants 7 or 8 of, in this case, my enterprise software licenses, for the first 4, they're paying at rate A. And then for the remainder, everything beyond 4, they will pay price B. So we can graduate up the tier. So just the simple idea here that we've got some new product mechanics, and we're going to continue to make investments in how the products work. For example, usage is coming, so that if you have really complex product environments, we can support those. The quote itself, of course, is, that's the approval engine. I'll get to that in just a moment. The quote itself is a what you see is what you get editor now. So for those of us that are familiar with the legacy quoting system, it sort of walked me through a handful of steps. When I'm in a deal, and I'm in the quote now, but when I'm in a deal and I hit add quote, if I've purchased the new CPQ product, we actually, first thing we do is we ask the seller to select a template. So I should call out that you can curate all the templates. The idea is we want to overcome this cold start problem. And so the seller will then grab the appropriate template, depending on maybe my segment or whatever the behavior is that I want to use in my template. And we will drop you into an area now where you've got configurability to organize this thing and effectively achieve some of that presentment that you want to make sure we're doing to give our customers our best foot forward. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you that each one of these modules is editable. We've got the quote summaries, we've got the buyer seller details, again, all being ingested from the deal properties, the company properties, the contact properties, so the seller doesn't have to go and reinvent the wheel on that. When I simply come into line items, you can see I can even just make edits right here into the quote. I'm going to actually take this back down to a 10% discount because I want to show you something really slick here. One thing we've done is we've now introduced this ability to create these approvals. So right now, it looks like my quote doesn't have any problems, which is great. I could send this to my customer and it wouldn't have to go to anybody. But in this case, my customer is really begging me to perhaps toss this implementation in for free. When I actually make that adjustment, now you can see that we've triggered some approvals here right at the quote level. So for example, I've got one, I'm getting hit with a, hey, you're north of 50% for a particular line item. And I've even got another approval because you've exceeded the total contract, right, of 20%. So the net headline here is, as your sellers are engaging with a quoting system, we now can leverage these workflows to actually curate the approvals requirements. I've got line item discount approvals. I've even got like a net 30. If my customer wants to bill beyond net 30, I might trigger that. That might go to my CFO for cash flow purposes. So I string these two views together just to showcase that the seller can now go about their day curating the quote that they would like. They can add their line items. They can do all of the things that they normally would do to actually configure the quote. But in the course of doing so, we also can give you those smart approvals so we can create and capture those appropriate revenue guardrails so that we're not just, again, throwing stuff over the fence without our customers knowing or without our CFO being in some control. I will show one last thing that I'm really excited about. Speed, visibility, control. In my mind, these are the 3 core pillars of value that we stand to drive in our CPQ offering. Speed, it's really easy for the quote editor to build the quote. Visibility, sellers can now come in the quote section and they can start to track engagement of their quotes. So as that end of quarter starts to rear up, I've got my discounts, I've got my deadlines, I've got my quote expiration dates. How many times we send quotes out with expiration dates, they expire, and the customer still gets what they want? With this view, we can now give the seller way better fidelity on exactly who's opening it, when are they opening it. Hey, buyer, you told me we would be done at 4:45 on a Friday. We both wanted to go out and have dinner with our family. I see you opening it. How can I help? So we're going to create a new level of visibility to help you triangulate on the whether or not these quotes are going to get done, again, in service of creating a more predictable business so we can roll something up to our CRO that we can rely on. And then finally, the last call out, just really quickly, is it wouldn't be Commerce Hub if we didn't have the ability to capture the payment right inside of the quote. So I've pivoted now. In my scenario, let's say I've sent the quote. And so here I am, the seller. This is me, Adam, sending the quote. For example, maybe in this case, I'm going to put my Brian hat on. I'm selling something to you, Brian. You're looking at this quote that I've sent you, and you just simply come down to the bottom, you sign this quote, but as the moment that the deal is signed, we're also presenting you with a place to go make the payment. So we wanted to very cleanly and seamlessly integrate the actual vendor acceptance step, the payment step, right into the quote signing process, so that we give you a really tight and controlled quote all the way to actual cash collection, billing, invoicing, etc., in one system, so that our customers aren't having to be chased down, for example, by maybe the accounts receivable team after they've signed the deal.
Mhm.
So we've sort of baked all of these things in, and you can expect to see us go really, really hard at continuing to deepen this offering, both by way of configuration as well as downstream revenue management. But at the highest level, we've simply made this quoting process really fast for sellers, give them the visibility so they can create those controls. And of course, finally, our executive team sleeps easier at night knowing now that we've got the approvals matrix built that will support our profitability plans.
This looks great, Adam. Thank you for sharing. Is it safe to say it looks like I feel like there's been some enhancements even since inbound? Is that correct? Maybe some new
Yeah.
betas and some other functionalities continue to get added? Because I mean, this is, even I think a few steps more robust than we saw back together in September.
It's a great call out, Brian. So we were hard at work, for something like 10, 11 months building CPQ, but really that was sort of, like I had mentioned, kind of concrete foundation. And so it is important to acknowledge that we didn't stop at inbound. We in fact have a roadmap. I'm surrounded by world-class product managers and engineers. It's such a delight to be able to come to work every day, and they are not slowing down. We in fact have a ton of plans to span the surface area of heavy duty configurator as well as quote to cash. So you're going to see a ton of net new offerings coming online in just even the next few weeks. So if you are interested in perhaps learning about some of the additional roadmap items, which again, start to talk about how we take that data from the quote and make it manageable for our net dollar retention strategy, for our expansion strategy, for our co-terming and automatic proration calculations. These are all enhancements that we're going to be able to give to the market so that they don't have to go between two different business systems and figure that out, right? Of course, our sellers are probably the ones that are doing that, and then delivering bad data maybe to a accounts receivable team that then has to reject the quote. All of that will
No,
be
we don't say those words around here.
yeah, right. Exactly. You please don't give me a system that forces me to have to go back to college to figure out how to do basic calculus. We want to make it really easy. And the good news is that being a part of HubSpot, we're approaching everything we're doing with that genuine, fast, easy, and unified approach.
That's awesome. Thank you, Adam. You kind of answered my last question here, but just to give you kind of one more opportunity here. For me, this feels like just the beginning, right? Like we've got an awesome offer here that I think exceeded expectations for our go-to-market offering. A lot of potential, a lot of capabilities. Let's wrap here, but a final quick question for you here. Anything that's kind of coming down the pipe that folks may be excited about or maybe curious about, kind of, or maybe, from your own vision, kind of where do you see HubSpot taking CPQ next? And just anything to look out for.
Yeah, the most exciting thing for me, which is coming next, which is really kind of we're actually going into an alpha here pretty soon, is the ability to take all of our actual quote data, specifically entitlements data, and because now we're surfacing net new data points that perhaps weren't as easy in the old days, that is effective dates, start dates, end dates. We are now going to create and capture a robust object that will actually help you do things like amendment deals. So that's a really important addition because now we're starting to talk about revenue reporting, knock on wood, and maybe within a window of time, revenue recognition. Now that's not something we want to do right away, but the idea of being able to deliver solid revenue reporting in the same system that I'm reporting my marketing performance, it's a very big promise that we want to deliver on that will ultimately help customers, especially in the earlier phases of digital transformation, be able to take advantage of a tremendous amount of horsepower. So now I can go marketing, sales, and revenue management in the same system. That's a massive promise that we aim to deliver on. And then because we're going to do it in a way where we're presenting it in a tight object, it's contained, which means we can now also extensively move it into different downstream systems for our more enterprise customers. So a lot of that stuff, and I don't want to give too much away around those details because it's going to be
Sure.
released here pretty soon. But if anybody's interested in how we're going to help connect the entire revenue lifecycle, please do not hesitate to reach out. And certainly, Brian would love to make sure that we're giving your team inside of the tent details too.
Of course, I'll take you up on that. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Adam. I really appreciate it. It's been an awesome session, probably my favorite so far. Yeah, for our listeners out there, we appreciate your time. And Adam's contact information will be made available if anyone wants to reach out directly with more questions about this.
Brian, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for setting this up, and more to come. I'm looking forward to coming back, and even in just a few short weeks or months or quarters, we can. There's just so much more to talk about.
You got it.